We're going to start. Rory? Thanks. It's not getting any better. Do you need a microphone?
Welcome to the UUCC, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua. We are a group of spiritual freethinkers who gather to celebrate life, build community, and better the world. Wherever you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. I'm Karen Alvarez, your worship associate for this morning, and the service today will be led by our minister, Eileen Casey Campbell. Thank you to everyone on this morning's worship team, also including music by Bill Mills. And Children's Church for Children 3 and over by Laura Wink and Kaya Mills. If this is your first visit, welcome. We invite you to sign the visitor's book in the entryway. And whether it's your first visit or your 1,000th, we're glad that you came. This service is also being live streamed to our YouTube channel. We will plan on continuing with hybrid worship services throughout the church year, so you can join us each week here in person, on Zoom, or later on YouTube. I have a few announcements to share with you today. If you have a joy or sorrow to share, please fill out the card on your chair. We invite you to bring them forward and place them in the basket after Bill rings the chimes and begins to play. You can also come forward to drop a pebble in the water at that time if you have a joy or sorrow that you'd prefer not to share publicly. We had a fabulous Easter egg hunt yesterday. There were about 22 or so kids at the beginning. Another 4 or 5 joined mid-hunt. I think all the eggs got found, but feel free to look around just in case. There's also some extra cookies from the bake sale on the back, if that sounds delicious for you. It was really successful. The kids had a blast. They were so excited. And there were a lot of good mix of new faces and some people we haven't seen in a while. So really, really nice time. Are there any other announcements for the good of the community this morning? Yes, Brandon, you can now do your canvas moments.
Good morning. I'm Brandon Steele, for those that don't know me. I was asked by Pat to just tell a little bit about what this church means for me. Right now we're beginning our pledge campaign and stewardship campaign. I've had, like many of you, I didn't come from this area or even this religion. I grew up out in Idaho. I was raised LDS. It was a very, very involved church. I went and lived in Australia for a few years doing missionary work, and I had this big change in my life that kind of left me stranded. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I wanted something that felt a little bit more authentic to myself. And I feel so fortunate that I was able to find this church. I moved across the country 7 or 8 years ago with my family, and I found a place where my kids feel comfortable, I feel comfortable, and I feel happy to see so many people that just have so many unique stories. Many of you know my kids have a lot of energy, and sometimes that can feel a little bit scary, bringing kids into a place like this and thinking, well, what could happen? I don't know. But I know that whatever happens, it's a place where we can feel comfortable and welcome here. And so that's why I pledge my funds and my time, because this is an organization that I care about and that I see do so much good. It's been such a blessing in my life for my family, and I love being a part of it and giving of the resources that I have to help this community grow and be just a wonderful place for everyone that comes. So thank you so much for being here. I love being here with you all, and I hope that you'll all consider as we move forward to pledge for this coming year to look and see how you can give and contribute to help this community stay a wonderful place to be. Thank you.
As we prepare to be fully together, I remind you to silence your phones and devices. Now is the time to bring forward any joys and sorrows, and we now enter a space of worship. Do I have a chalice helper this morning? Thank you. Thank you for your enthusiasm. I invite you to join with me in our chalice lighting words as the flame is lit. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
This morning about my dad, who even before his Alzheimer's diagnosis the last 5 or 6 years ago, lived his life under the motto that Mark Twain wrote, never let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? And when I say he lived his life this way, I really do mean it. He met my mother under some fake persona he had concocted. He was telling her a story about a job that he didn't have and a name that wasn't his. And yet, I don't know, somehow she did marry him. So it must have been a good story, in spite of its total lack of truthfulness. I spent a lot of my childhood thinking that he had panned for gold in the Yukon. And he's an old dad. He was 45 when I was born, but he's not that old of a dad. That didn't happen. I'm still, as an adult, not sure how much of his cowboy stories from his time living in Texas and Oklahoma before he came back to farm in Vermont are really true or not, but I know they're sensational. They're great stories. And I think, hear me out, I think that's why we come to church, really, right? Hear me out. Not for a false story, but for a good story. Because simple facts, a newspaper story, an arrangement of realism is not enough to live by, right? We come here because we can find facts, we can look for evidence in the world around us, but we need a story, we need a lot of stories, we need a collective imagination to make meaning out of it. And I hope that's what we're doing today. I hope that's what we're doing every Sunday. So will you, as we imagine together this morning, will you rise in body or in spirit and sing together with me our opening hymn, number 21, For the Beauty of the Earth? Story. And if you're a small person, or even if you're a big person, and you'd like to come closer and sit on the floor up front, here they come. To hear the story a little better, you can do that now or anytime you feel like it during the story. And if you want to bring a grown-up with you, thank you for the example, Elliot. You can bring a grown-up with you if they're willing. So I don't know if anybody was at the Zoom or the in-person service that we did with our other two neighbor UU churches on Friday night. But we heard the first part of this Easter story then, and it had a sad ending. It was kind of a sad service that Friday night before Easter. And it ended when Jesus had died, right? Anybody remember that? Sorry to let you know this morning. That's how the story ended on Friday, and that's where we're picking it up this morning. This story is an adaptation from a book by somebody whose name we don't know, but we call him Mark. And it starts like this. Jesus had died. He was on the cross. And as the sun sank low in the sky, a small group of his friends, Mary Magdalene, a different Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, watched as his body was wrapped in linen cloth and taken to a tomb cut out of rock in a nearby olive grove. What about the proper burial traditions? His friends asked anxiously, because they wanted to care for the body of their friend and their teacher. They're going to have to wait, answered Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb they were borrowing. The Sabbath day of rest is beginning, and we cannot do them now. We have no time. Let us roll the stone door in place for now. So they pushed a big round stone along a groove in the rock. They guided it firmly over the entrance of the cave, and they left. When the Sabbath was over, the women brought spices and oil so that they could go and anoint their friend. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb together. They had been saying on the road along the way to one another, "Who will roll away the heavy stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled back already. And as they entered the tomb, they saw not the body of their friend, but a young man dressed in white, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. I mean, I would be too, right? But he said to them, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him, but he has gone ahead. But go and tell his disciples and his friend Peter that he is going ahead of you." So they went out. They fled the tomb with terror and amazement both. They had nothing to say to anyone because they were too afraid. And so they kept quiet for a while. And this is the end of our story this morning.
Now is the time in our service to join together in the spiritual practice of giving. Our gifts of both time and money support our church in its work. Each week, we would like to spotlight a group or committee and thank them for their gift of time. This week, the group is the Church Governing Board. We are getting towards the end of the fiscal year, which means there are opportunities for people who are interested in being board members. It's not a tremendous time commitment. It's a couple hours a month. And it helps with keeping the congregation on track and sorting through to make sure that our projects are meeting our values and the needs of the congregation. So if this is something that you might be interested in, please reach out to Thomas Lyon, who's in the back here today, because we are always open to shaking that up a little bit with new members. 1/4 of our plate collection for the muddy season goes to Sustainable Finger Lakes, a community-based organization whose mission is to promote the long-term well-being of our region by integrating social equity, economic vitality, ecological stewardship, and shared responsibility. You can give to this morning's offering by placing cash or a check into the basket or by one of the options on your screen. Please make a note that your gift is intended for today's offering. We now gratefully accept the offering.
That's my kid. Friends, we are a community that holds one another in our joys and in our sorrows. In our celebrations and in our pain, we say to one another, we are with you. This morning, we share some joys and some sorrows with one another. We share the sorrow of reconnecting and navigating a stressful time, helping a mom enter the next phase of life. We share with Abby and Poppy both joy and grief at the end of their breastfeeding journey. Together, growing up has so many big feelings. For these and the joys and sorrows still in the silence of our hearts, Karen will drop a stone in the water and we will promise to one another we are with you. Will you say it with me? We are with you. And now, if you are heading to religious education with Laura and Miss Kaya, it is time to meet them at the stairs. Now is the time in our service for centering and meditation, followed by some shared silence. We remember, of course, that by silence we mean the absence of grown-ups talking to one another so that we can listen more closely to the sounds of life, to the busy world going by outside, a bird in the tree by our window perhaps, to the wiggles and giggles of our children downstairs, the breath of the neighbor in the seat beside us, the beating of our own hearts. So let us get comfortable where we sit. Take a deep breath. Turn our attention inward. Perhaps let our eyes fall closed. I offer these words of meditation this morning called Chrysalis Diary by Paul Fleischman. November 13th. Cold told me to fasten my feet to this branch, to dangle upside down from my perch, to shed my skin, to cease being a caterpillar, and I have obeyed. December 6th. Green, the color of leaves and life, has vanished. The empire of leaves lies in ruins. I study the brown new world around me. I fear the future. I hear few sounds. Have any others of my kind survived this cataclysm? Swinging back and forth in the wind, I feel immeasurably alone. January 4th. I can make out snow falling. For 5 days and nights it's been drifting down. I find I never tire of watching the flakes in their multitudes passing the window. My world is now white. Astounding. I enter these wondrous events in my chronicle, knowing no reader would believe me. February 12th. An ice storm last night. Unable to see out at all. This morning, I hear boughs cracking and branches falling. Hungry for sounds in this silent world, I cherish these, ponder their import, miser them away in my memory, and wait for more. March 31st. I wonder whether I am the same being who started this diary. I felt stormy inside like the weather without. My mouth is reshaping, my legs are dissolving, wings are growing. My body is not mine. This morning, a breeze from the south, strangely fragrant, a red-winged blackbird's call in the distance, a faint glimpse of green in the branches. And now I recall that last night I dreamt of flying. A reading from Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. She writes this. The contemporary sperm whale, Physeter macrocephalus, can't tell you how many times I practiced that. Like 3. Let's not give me too much credit. Has an ancestor with an over-the-top literary name, Leviathan Melville, named backwards after the biblical sea monster, Leviathan, and Herman Melville. The ancestor known for its sharp teeth and massive size. In fact, paleontologists claim they had the largest teeth of any animal ever, excluding tusks, at over a foot long. Debates are happening on the internet right now about who would win in a battle between this whale and the ancient megalodon shark that lived at the same time. They call this whale raptorial, monstrous, inherently violent. I wonder all the time about creation and destruction, the role of ancestral power, surrender and change. I wonder what happened over millions of years from being known for its sharp teeth to evolve into one whose teeth scientists now theorize are never used to chew, but are actually mechanisms that simply attune their echolocation. Is that possible? That what was made to puncture you could now be used to listen deeply? Is the sperm whale diving deep for ancestral elevation? Or was that always the function of their teeth? Did the sea monster stories bias us? The way I look back is influenced by the stories I know now. And I do think that some of my ancestors were monsters. And I do still hold the power to create and destroy, if first in my imagination. And I thought my sharp critique was such a big deal once, how I could use it to cut through the obstacles in my path, to wound the self-righteous. Yes, I aspired to dominate in a world that oppressed me, but now I need antennae for a world I can't imagine yet. Now I need to listen more than I need to say this, but I still do need to say this. I surrender to a love so big it could face and acknowledge monsters, to a love so deep and wide it could create oceans and whales, to an ancestral reach so long it could become us. And when they name us back, what will they say? What stories will they tell? How great a love that could create all this. How will they name all of what we destroyed? I surrender to a love too big to name. I always choose an adaptation of the story from Mark's Gospel that we told this morning on Easter. I like it because it's the oldest story of Jesus' death that we have, though there were definitely earlier stories. Mark didn't write his down until at least 50 years after the time period in question. And actually, we don't, like I said to the kids, we don't really know who Mark was. Like, we don't even know his real name. We just decided to call him Mark, and when I say we, I mean like a bunch of guys more than 1,000 years ago. He might have been named Steve or Lindsay. Probably not. We can tell a few things from the context of his whole piece of writing that we have. We know he was Jewish, he makes that clear. We know that he was aligned with the post-Jesus Jewish separatists who would only later become their own religion. We know he was in a hurry. He wrote, like Alexander Hamilton, the musical version at least, like he was running out of time. And more so than Hamilton, he probably believed that he really was. His whole short gospel lurches one scene after another straight toward the crucifixion. And then it ends in this abrupt, confusing moment where Jesus' friends return to clean his body when the Sabbath is over and find an empty tomb. The end. For real. That was, before all the subsequent edits, the original ending. We can assume from the editing and the additions in later Gospels, it left readers feeling like, what the hell just happened? And if you've ever lost someone important to you, you probably know that feeling. The feeling of an empty room we can't wrap our mind around. If you've ever lost hope in what you believed in so fervently, you definitely know that feeling. The disoriented feeling of, I don't know this place. This isn't where I've been before. The sensation of hurtling toward what turns out to be the edge of a cliff. In those 50 or so years between Jesus' execution and Mark's writing, the Roman Empire had violently crushed the many anti-Roman Jewish movements, like the sect Jesus had led. It retook full political control of Jerusalem. It burned down the temple, which had been the sole site of Jewish worship in the world. So while Mark's Easter story has always been my go-to, because I think it accurately reflects the shock and trauma of all that, the miracle of meeting your lost friend and leader on the road, of touching his body and knowing it is real and living, I understand why you'd want to add that bit in. I get why the other guys put in the resurrection bit, right? The sensation of knowing that if your friend is still here, then so must be all that you pledged yourselves to together. I think there are probably few of us, if any, who show up here in this congregation on Easter Sunday because we believe in the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Love that for you if you do. I think we're probably few and far between. But still we tell this story every year because the miracle of resurrection saved this little band of Jewish rebels in first century Palestine, and not because they needed a miracle. Their friend was long dead before the stories were written. The temple was gone. They didn't need a miracle, they needed a story of a miracle. Their movement had lurched full speed toward its early death, and it needed the hope that only a good miracle story can imbue. And the story, these books, they started writing a few decades into their despair. It not only saved them, it became the foundation of who they were. It became the foundation of a new faith. We have our own miracle story as Unitarian Universalists, did you know? Just the one, pretty much. We tell the story of the beginnings of the Universalist Church in the Americas as a modern miracle. For about as long as there have been followers of Jesus, there have been Universalists, believers in universal salvation, in a love that would never leave anyone out. But there wasn't a church that held universalism as its doctrine until about the 18th century. John Murray was a Calvinist preacher in England in the mid to late 1700s who was starting to doubt what he'd been taught about salvation. He was struggling to believe in a God who would save the world, but not all of it, who would die for some of us, but not all of us. And as his heart turned toward universalism, he didn't know what to do. All sorts of personal trauma piled onto John's crisis of faith. His wife and young son had died. He fell into debt. He fell into conflict with his church over these growing beliefs. So he decided to leave his home and his church and his job behind and set out for the British colonies in the Americas. He sailed on a boat for New York, but it was blown off course in a storm and ended up running aground in New Jersey. Meanwhile, in the little town where his boat was stuck, waiting for a change of wind, that's rough, yeah. Thank you, Abby. As he sat there waiting, there was a small community of people who shared a belief in universalism in this little town. They had no formal church to belong to, so they had built a meeting house in the woods where they gathered on Sundays for about 10 years, hoping and praying all that time for a clergy person who could lead their community. Stranded on the Jersey Shore, title of a great reality show, which I would totally watch, John Murray walked into town to find some hospitality. The first door that he knocked on was the home of Thomas Potter, one of the leaders of this little Universalist community. He welcomed John in, he fed him, he talked with him, and when he found out who he was, he said, "We have been waiting for you for a long time." And John stayed. He led that small community. He went on to found others, and he's known as the father of American Universalism, the spiritual ancestor of half of our movement. This miracle story has been told in Universalist and then Unitarian Universalist churches on Sunday mornings for almost 250 years. And do we think it really happened that way? Like, could the details of the miracle possibly be true? You can see how it doesn't really matter, right? We don't tell it as a historical account. We tell it for the hope it inspires in its listeners, and the hope, the collective imagination of a world that is possible, that's as real and true as it gets. In my family, this is the resurrection miracle that we tell. Maybe you have your own. I grew up hearing this story the same way my mom did and her mom before her. My great-great-grandfather, Matthew, came to this country during the Great Hunger in Ireland, which is sometimes called a famine, but famines are accidents of nature, and this was a genocide. He was just a child when he came, 9 years old, with his 12-year-old sister, Nellie, their mother, and a baby sibling whose name was lost somewhere in the family lore. They were starving, literally, hungry enough, like a million of their fellow citizens, to leave everything they knew, to spend all they had to step onto what people were calling coffin boats in a last desperate attempt to survive. An uncle of theirs had come to New York about a year prior, settling in a small farming town in the Hudson Valley, and they planned to sail to New York Harbor where he would meet them. Because the coffin ships were crowded and filthy, Diseases spread during the passage across the Atlantic. And on this journey, my ancestors got sick with what was probably dysentery. That's how the story goes. And the mother, my thrice great-grandmother, and the forgotten named baby both died. Then the ship had to change course because of weather concerns and ended up docking in Boston instead of New York. So these two children who'd survived disease and genocide and impossible loss, who could barely read and write, who had barely ever left their family farm before, found themselves alone in Boston in 1845. So they started walking. They walked and they walked for days. They walked in the general direction of the Hudson Valley, checking road signs and asking strangers for directions along the way. They slept in ditches and under bridges. They foraged food in the woods until finally they showed up at the door of their uncle's house weeks later to the astounded arms of family who had thought they were dead. I'm not sure how much of that story is true. They came here in 1845. We have the boat records. I'm sure that the trauma and loss that they brought with them was too big to carry without a miracle story to hold it in. It was too big to pass on to their children's children's children without setting it in the context of a story that allowed us all to imagine hope against impossible odds. When I tell this story to my children some 5 generations later, I'm sure there are elements that have been changed or embellished by editors along the way. But I tell it as a story for them to hold, not because they need the reality of that miracle, but because they might need the capacity to imagine the next one, to imagine the impossible. The power of the story is not its historicity. The same goes for John Murray and for Jesus' rising from dead. The power is in the telling, in our collective imagination of the impossible. In seminary, I had an assignment to write a paper on the Exodus story, the story of Passover, answering the following questions as factually as possible. When does the story take place? Let me just remind you that I went to a Baptist seminary. So I was asked to answer these questions as factually as possible. When does the story take place? Who left Egypt with Moses and how many of them? And where did they cross over? So who, when, and where? And I'm like a big old nerd, you know this. I love biblical anthropology. I love the exegesis of a text. I poured through textbooks and scholarly articles looking for these facts, compiling answers in a paper that got longer and longer as scholars disagreed about one piece of evidence or another. And the story, one of my favorite stories of all time, started to fall apart for me. The text in Exodus says over 500,000 enslaved people escaped, a population greater than the whole of Israel even during its period of monarchy. So the question of who were they all becomes quickly impossible to answer. The internal timeline of the Bible disagrees with itself on when this miracle occurred, giving different times in the book of Exodus and the book of Chronicles, like different by 1,000 years, not a small discrepancy. There is the problem of Egypt's excellently preserved records and not even a hint of a primary source outside of the Bible that suggests a population of enslaved Hebrews ever lived in Egypt, let alone escaped from there. And then, of course, Bible scholars debate the location of the great miracle of the crossing of the sea. The Red Sea is the setting most Bible translators and movie makers have chosen for the last few millennia, but some scholars think the smaller seasonal marsh of the Reed Sea is more plausible, trying, I guess, to find some plausibility in a story that isn't really interested in realism. And here is where my own paper started to go off the rails. If the Reed Sea makes more sense, I started to think, then it should be the Red Sea. It doesn't lift my spirit to hear about a few guys tromping across a seasonal marsh. I want walls of water hundreds of feet high and a whole nation walking through on dry land. Like, don't you? That's the movie we want to watch. Why are we trying to squeeze plausibility into this impossible tale? I found myself asking. I can't report on facts here because if there were ever facts to this story, they are totally obscured by the grandiosity of the miracle. And that's what makes it a good story. We need the miracle story, not the facts. That's why this story was told. Maybe there are some folk origins to it based in history, but we know it was never written down until Israelites enslaved in Babylon decided to write it in the 700s BCE. They weren't trying to document their history, so the historical facts did not matter much to them. They were trying to create a miracle story large enough to hold an impossible hope. The hope of a world where they themselves might be liberated. The hope of a God who is on the side of the slave. The hope of a world on the other shore of a whole sea of despair. They didn't need a miracle, they needed the story of a miracle. They needed the chance to imagine impossible things together when their own liberation from the violence of empire seemed impossible. And that story, along with all the stories they wrote, the stories of liberation, the poems of hope and grief, of longing and despair, the stories of a world that bends itself toward justice became the miracle themselves. They became the foundation of a community that did not die by empire's hand because a story that magnificent cannot be killed. A friend of mine shared a meme on social media this week asking something like, how do you go on teaching your children to sing songs while the world is burning? To which she replied, how do you not? What else could be more important? In the face of imperial violence like state-sanctioned executions and hungry children and bombs falling and a planet on fire, what could be more important than teaching our children to sing out a story of impossible hope? What could matter more than telling the tales of the miracle of a world as it could be, as it ought to be? The tales of impossible, impractical hope that lie quietly in every one of our tender hearts. More precious than anything real and tangible, concrete and evidentiary is the story we imagine together about a world that seems impossible in the face of all this sorrow. To close, I want to share with you this poem we read on Friday night at our joint Tenebrae service with our other local UUs. It's called If I Must Die by Palestinian poet Rafat al-Arir, who did die when the IDF bombed his apartment building on December 6th in Gaza. The machine of imperial violence in Gaza that killed al-Arir still continues, with more than 30,000 civilians dead, almost half of them children, and surviving Gazans left with so few resources that the UN would like to call it a famine, but as we have covered, famines are accidents of nature, and this is a genocide. Al-Arir wrote this: if I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, and make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. Friends, I don't stand here to read Al-Arir's poetry to tell you we need a miracle. That's garbage. We need a ceasefire. We need climate justice. We need liberation for everybody. All of which is to say, we don't need a miracle. We do need the story of a miracle. Maybe every story of a miracle we've got. We need to be able to imagine a love so deep and so wide, so miraculous that it couldn't possibly leave anyone out. We need the collective imagination of a world as it could be, the world that feels impossible, but isn't. Amen.
There is a land high on a hill where I am going. There is a voice that calls to me. The air is sweet, the grass is waving, the wind is blowing away up in the farthest field. Oh, with me and we will see the mystery revealed. When one day we wend our way up to the farthest field, the sun will rise, the sun will set across the mountains, and we will live with beauty there. The fragrant flowers, the days and hours will not be counted, and peaceful songs will fill the air. Oh, walk with me and we will see the mystery revealed. When one day we wend our way up to the farthest field, I know one day I'll leave my home here in the valley and climb up to that hill so fair. And when I'm called and counted in that final tally, I know that I will see you there. Oh, walk with me and we will see the mystery revealed. When one day we wend our way up to the farthest field. Oh, my dear friend, I truly love to hear your voices lifted up in radiant song. Go through the years, how we all have made our separate choices. We bend here where we belong. Oh, walk with me and we will see the mystery revealed. When one day we wend our way up to the farthest field. Oh, walk with me, we will see the mystery revealed. When one day we wend our way up to the farthest field. Up to the farthest
My friends, if we find ourselves in what feels like an ocean of despair impossibly large, Let us lift our voices and sing out a story of impossible love. Will you rise in body and spirit and sing together? Our closing hymn is in the gray hymnal number 344, A Promise Through the Ages Rings.
Promise to the ages rings that always, always something sings. Not just in May, in December's coldest hour, unknown of hope sustains us all. Our life is made of many things, but stars we keep and broken rings. And it be true that through all things there always, always something sings. Our universal song of life. When you live in our deepest care, our faith seems more than we can bear. But days shall pass, and yet shall fade, and we need from snow. Our rose pearl and comes song. Something always, always sings. This is our message, Eastern plains. Not we despair and perish things, but we should always, always sing. And something always, always sing.
Please join me in our words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame,
But not the light of truth,
the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.